It's Monday morning, you're on your way to work, when out of nowhere, another vehicle crashes into the side of your car, spinning you around in the middle of the intersection. Thankfully, no one is seriously hurt, and the other driver comes around to apologize, make sure you're okay, and hand you a business card from the company that owns the vehicle. You leave the scene feeling pretty good and confident that the company's insurance is going to cover your costs. Then the weeks pass, and your car still isn't repaired when you receive a letter stating that the company that owns the car that hit you isn't liable for your damages. How could that happen? Most of us drive nearly every day, and most of us will eventually be involved in a traffic accident in some way, shape, or form. As a claims adjuster, investigating accidents and determining liability is what I do every day. I've seen firsthand how often people get frustrated because they believe they have a simple claim only to receive an unexpected outcome, or worse, a denial. The truth is, many people think a liability claim is a single decision. In reality, it's a process involving several different questions that must all be answered before any payment can be made. Claims are not determined by appearances, apologies, or who suffered the greatest injury. It depends on insurance coverage, evidence, and the application of legal principles. Today we're going to cover and see the differences between first-party and third-party claims, how adjusters investigate an accident, and how liability is actually determined. But before we can understand why claims are denied, we first need to understand what type of insurance claim we're actually talking about. One of the most misunderstood parts of the claims process is the difference between first-party and third-party insurance. According to the BPS Lawyer's website, if you're like most people, you're going to nod along while having no idea what the adjusters are actually talking about. So let's break it down. A first-party claim is one that you file with your own insurance company under the policy that you purchased, with the intention that your insurance pays for your damages. A third-party claim is one that you file against another person's insurance company because you believe they caused your damages. In that case, their insurance is set to pay for your damages. That distinction matters because the two insurance companies have very different responsibilities. Your own insurer generally has a contract with you, and they have to provide the coverages that you pay for. But a third-party liability insurer has no relationship with you whatsoever. Before it pays your claim, it has to first figure out whether or not its client is actually legally responsible for your damages. So what happens after you file a liability claim? As Catherine Knotts of the Carlson Law Firm explained in an interview published on KBTX3's website, determining liability requires extensive investigation beyond what can be determined at the crash scene. The investigation usually begins with coverage. Before anything else, the insurance company has to figure out whether its own policy even applies to the accident. For example, if the employee that was driving that company vehicle was using it without the company's permission, there may be no coverage available under that liability policy. But if coverage does exist, the adjuster then begins gathering evidence. This can include anything like a recorded statement, police report, witness interviews, vehicle damage photos, and scene inspections. Now, because evidence doesn't always match up and often conflicts, adjusters simply can't accept the first version of events that they hear. Instead, they have to compare every available piece of information to determine what can actually be supported by the evidence. So gathering evidence answers the question of what happened. The next step is determining what that evidence means under the law. Let's return to our accident from earlier on. At first glance, it seems obvious that the company should pay the claim, but several different issues could change the outcome. Imagine that there's no independent witnesses, no dash cam footage, and both drivers insist that they have the green light. The adjuster simply can't decide which person seems more believable. The decision has to be based on evidence that can actually be proven and on the laws that apply to the claim. In Florida, for example, we have a no-fault insurance law that limits when an injured person can pursue certain damages against another driver, even when the fault appears clear. As the Insurance Information Institute website explains, no-fault auto insurance laws require every driver to file a claim with their own insurance company after an accident, regardless of who's at fault. This often surprises people because many of the things that we naturally associate with faults are not legally conclusive. An apology at the scene, a traffic citation, or even a serious injury may all be important pieces of evidence, but none of them automatically determine liability by themselves. Adjusters compare facts against traffic laws, applicable case law, and legal standards of negligence to determine whether a driver breached the duty of care and whether that breach caused another person's damages. Their goal isn't to decide who seems more believable. Their goal is to determine what can actually be established by the available evidence. Understanding this process helps explain why the outcome of a claim doesn't always match what people expect. So today we've seen that a liability claim involves much more than simply deciding who caused an accident. First, we distinguished between first-party and third-party claims. Then we examined how adjusters investigate accidents and gather evidence and evaluate that evidence. Then finally, we looked at how legal principles are applied to determine liability and discussed why claims that appear straightforward can still be denied because of coverage issues, insufficient evidence, or legal limitation. So the next time you hear someone say, "It wasn't my fault," remember that those words alone do not determine the outcome of a liability claim.